Life after death. Eyewitness accounts.
During the winter session of my junior year at the University of Northern Colorado, I was enrolled in a tennis class. It was too cold to play on the courts. So we were banging balls against the walls of the indoor gym when I began to feel the pain from my migraine escalating rapidly. I was scared when I realized that by the end of the lesson the pain would be out of my control. I was prescribed medication that I carried with me so I could use it when the pain was too much. I've only used it on a few rare occasions when I felt like I couldn't function at all. It would put me to sleep for about 24 hours. I needed to go back to my dorm room. But I felt like I couldn't wait. I was on medication thinking I was going to faint and hoping someone would somehow bring me home. For as long as I can remember, I have suffered from headaches. As I entered adolescence, they got worse. I was even hospitalized for an examination to rule out brain tumors. I got advice after one doctor suggested they were stress-related. I eventually began daily treatment with several prescribed medications. My migraines usually lasted for weeks. I was terrified of the pain and convinced that something was so terribly wrong with me that I would never live to be 20 years old. I felt depressed when I was supposed to celebrate my 20th birthday. I realized that I must continue, plan my life, look into the future, grow up. About 8 months after this event, in a tennis lesson, I took the medicine, which I saved for a time when the explosive pain was too much. I kept hitting the wall with the ball, feeling the medicine paralyze my body. The next memory I remember is returning to the hostel. It was a 15 to 20 minute journey, but I only remember a moment. I walked alone, up the hill past the campus bookstore. Then I remember sitting in my dorm room worrying about a job that I knew was coming out soon. I just had to print the title page and it was done. I started to wonder if I was on medication or just thinking about taking it. I tried to remember, but I couldn't. I figured I must not have taken it as I was conscious and in pain. So I took another dose and then sat down at my typewriter to finish my article. It only took a few minutes to print the title page. And I knew from past experience that it would take longer for the medicine to work. A moment later, I lost control of my body and fell forward onto the typewriter. I was still conscious and had a migraine, but I couldn't move or feel anything below my neck. I just lay there helpless. I tried to call for help, but the cleaner was vacuuming in the corridor outside my room, and no one heard my screams. As soon as the vacuum cleaner turned off, I screamed again and the male student heard me. He cautiously entered my room and I asked him to help me get to bed. I told him that I was paralyzed. He pulled me out of the car and put me in a chair, but then let go and I fell forward, crashing face first into the car again. He didn't know what to do, so he asked for help. When he returned, he had a friend. The two of them struggled to carry me a few feet to the bed. As soon as I was in my bed, they left and I immediately fell asleep. In the dream, I realized that I felt no pain at all. I realized that I had never experienced any physical discomfort in my life. It was such an overwhelming realization. I didn't feel a migraine, not the bed underneath me, not the clothes on my body, not even my head on the pillow. It was such a relief. At the same time, I was filled with peace, contentment, joy, happiness and love. It was all so incredibly wonderful. I can't adequately explain to others how wonderful it was, but I remember it clearly. Even though more than 20 years have passed since that day, another transformation took place in my mind. I was fully alert and very interested in this experience. But my mind was not at all like the one I always had. I fully understood what was happening. I knew I was dead, but did not feel even a hint of fear, uncertainty or unwillingness. As I was going through this, I was distracted by my roommate, Trina, who came into the room, looked at me, sleeping, on the bottom bunk, and then climbed onto her top bunk. I marveled at the way she shook the bed as she got up, but I felt no pain. I watched as she took the Bible, opened it to the Psalms, and began to read. It was then when I looked over her shoulder to see what she was reading that I realized that I was no longer in my body. I looked at myself on the bottom bunk, looked back at Trina, and thought, "She doesn't even know I'm dead." This thought amused me. My attention left that room, and there was a period of time. Time was no longer a reality, when I rested at rest. Perhaps it was at this time that I received knowledge that I later remembered. But I have no memories of learning. I was not even aware of the sensation of movement until I began to see a glimmer of light in the distance and realized that I was in darkness, moving towards the light. When I think about it now, it reminds me of the time when I was a child and we explored the long, curved train tunnels in the mountains above our boarding school in Kenya. These tunnels were blacker than anything I had ever seen. I was not intimidated by the inability to see, the sounds and the knowledge that the tunnels were full of bats. I remember the feeling of relief when I first noticed a luminous dot in the distance. My fears dissipated as the light grew. This childhood memory is similar to the visual experience of moving towards the light, but the feelings and emotions couldn't be more different. I experienced a pleasure beyond anything my human mind could ever imagine. As the light grew and conquered the darkness, I ended up in the most beautiful place I have ever seen. A few years earlier I had observed the splendor of the Lake District in the north of England and marveled at its beauty. But the place where I went after my death was much more beautiful. There was a succession of hills and valleys through which streams flowed. The grass was greener than any lawn in the richest neighborhood. It was a beautiful sunny day and I was just enjoying the surroundings. I was alone, but I didn't really realize my loneliness. I didn't feel alone, but when I think about these beautiful hills, I don't have any memory of another person until I noticed a person standing right behind a low stone wall. I understood so much. I didn't have the limitations of the human mind. I knew that the man on the other side of the wall would lead me to God. I knew my experience was based on my needs. I saw a man I could trust. The other person would see what he needed to see. Previously, in my human mind, I only had a vague set of thoughts about the afterlife, but when I was there, I was in a place that I recognized, and this person was someone I had always known. I knew where I was going and what awaited me, and I was overjoyed. The man was casually dressed in jeans and a loose shirt. He was gentle, compassionate and focused on me. I looked into his eyes and suddenly understood that it is not yet my time to die. I was stunned. I knew that if I just stepped over the wall, I could continue. That I had a choice. But we both knew I had to go back. When I looked him in the face, I said, "My time has come." And he said, "No. It's not." Although it would take an endless number of pages to describe everything I learned and experienced, it all seemed to happen in an instant. I experienced only a small slice of the afterlife. But it was a profound experience. As soon as I realized that I had to return, I felt myself being pressed into my body. It was a cruel, painful and frightening moment. Every time I remember that moment, even now after all these years, I cry. I couldn't believe that I decided to come back. Have I forgotten the pain, stress, fear and limitations of being human? Yes. How could I leave peace, love and joy, the beauty that I came to? I knew that I could cross the wall. I could go on. What a fool I was. That returned. At the same time I regretted my decision. I was overwhelmed by the fear of death inherent in my human mind. I knew I was dead and I was scared. Although I had clear memories of the afterlife, I was torn apart by the fears that I had always had, and it seemed that at that moment I could not digest my experience well. As my roommate climbed down from the top bunk, I was woken up by intense pain from the movement of the bed. I remember how free I was of the pain as it rose. Words began to fall from my lips as I tried to explain what had happened. Her first reaction was disbelief. When I told her which part of the Bible she was reading while I was sleeping in the bottom bunk, she couldn't answer. She avoided further talk, but must have asked for help. The dormitory duty officer who was in charge of our floor came in. She was not a close friend, but I respected her. She listened and tried to understand. I begged her not to let me fall asleep. I told her that if I had a choice again, I would not come back. She finally left me and I fell asleep, but I was not given a second chance to die. I have never heard of anyone experiencing what I experienced. I felt alone and confused. I quickly became reluctant to talk, but I know that I fully understood it before I returned. I also understand that I needed to lose that memory. One of the greatest gifts from my glimpse into the afterlife is the comfort I feel when a friend or family member dies. My grief is real, my sense of loss. But I know that they are free and full of joy. Even though I rarely discussed my death, I sometimes tried to discuss what I learned during the experience. I am aware that I have knowledge beyond what I can remember, but what I have retained crystal clear. The biggest hurdle in telling others is finding the words. Even now, as I write all this, I am painfully aware that I am not even close to being able to truly describe what happened, what I felt, and what I learned. My religious views have changed the most. I grew up in a Christian family. My parents were missionaries in East Africa. At times I felt far from God or rebelled against the morality I had been brought up with, but I still considered myself a Christian. I believed that the Bible is the Word of God. I have sometimes wondered questions that divide religions, various theological issues, or concepts of salvation. At the time of my death, I gained an understanding that not only took me far beyond my previous beliefs, but in many ways disproved those beliefs. Since I had this understanding, I have sometimes ignored what I have learned and clung to beliefs I have held since childhood, and other times I have discarded beliefs that I know are human and not divine in origin. I had a hard time digesting what I learned. One result is that I am much more open to beliefs that are different from my own because I know how limited the human mind is. I know that God will reveal Himself to us, depending on our needs and our beliefs. God Himself, in the form of Jesus, tried His best to convey understanding to His closest devoted followers. The night before He died, His disappointment is evident as He realized that they simply didn't understand and His time was coming to an end. Jesus was limited by His humanity. The Holy Spirit is limited by our humanity. The Bible, despite being inspired by God, was written by people and read by people. This is due to the need to use words. It's deep but limited. It helps us to understand what is beyond our understanding. The undeserved, unconditional, unconscious love of God is beyond comprehension. The joy, peace, happiness, contentment, and love we experience in our lives are but a shadow of the afterlife. The concept of salvation is our attempt to understand what is already ours. Our understanding of salvation, no matter how much we argue about it, doesn't even come close to reflecting God's reality. I no longer try to find the truth because I know that in time we will all understand how truths fit together. The church, religion, is what we have done to try to understand what is beyond understanding, to limit the limitless, to control what is beyond control. Religion is the result of our inability to understand spirituality. And yet, it feeds us, helps us to become closer to God. It is our lifeline, it helps us to understand. It can also bring us pain, separation and confusion. I do not challenge religious beliefs. I am not trying to prove the validity of my experience. I try not to let church rules and regulations get in the way of my understanding. I just try to communicate with God as best I can. It took me many years to realize the change in my attitude after the experience of death, and I continue to remember, reflect and use what I have learned. At first I was alone with my experiences. I had this wonderful journey, all kinds of knowledge and understanding, but not being able to adequately express, still struggle, be heard or understood, so I tried to suppress everything. Then a professor of sociology whom I knew as a friend told me about the book by Kubler-Ross. Reading this was a real shock, as well as a huge sense of relief. After all, I wasn't alone. I could not believe the similarities between my experiences and those of others. I wanted to know more. I listened to a lecture on death and dying, assuming it would be a safe place to open up. When I wrote an article about my near-death experience, my instructor believed that what I experienced were hallucinations caused by a drug overdose. It took many years before I had friends who knew that I was honest, trustworthy and friends to whom I could trust my story. These friends encouraged me to talk more, read other books about NDEs, and apply what I learned more fully in my life. There were times when I felt so overwhelmed by the difficulties I faced in my life that I begged God to let me return to Him. I prayed for death, for the opportunity to experience this miracle again. I wondered why I had the opportunity to know how wonderful life after life is, since one of the results was a weakening of the will to live. But I have come to understand that knowing what unconditional love is, and experience that satisfaction, and remembering such beauty and peace means that I have the opportunity to bring it into my experience here and now and perhaps even help others understand. I don't have to wait until death. I have memories that can help enrich my life here. So much has changed in the last 20 years since I experienced the afterlife. And I'm not sure which changes are the result of that experience and which are just part of growing up. I believe that although I spent half my life repressing the memory of my death, it nevertheless affected me. A few years ago, a friend asked, if you had the chance again, would you step over the wall? Without hesitation, I replied, yes, definitely. She said, would you leave everything you have now? Yes, I would. I replied, not that I wanted to leave my children, wife, parents and all my friends, but I began to truly appreciate the chance given to me. And when the time comes, this all-consuming sense of peace will come to me.
See also other interesting videos about life after death on our channel.